My brother Grayson smirking across the dinner table, his voice booming, "Savannah's too good to help me. Some family, huh?" All because I wouldn't hand over my savings for his car. I'm Savannah, a 28-year-old just trying to build my own life in Asheville, not play bank for his schemes. Then I flipped the script, held up my phone with texts he'd sent, calling me selfish behind my back. The room went dead silent, his smug grin gone. What happened next? Did he talk his way out, or did our family finally see through him? Stick around to find out how one night changed everything. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if your sibling pulled that on you? I'd love to hear your stories. The wind howled outside my Asheville apartment, rattling the windows like it had a personal grudge. I barely noticed, though. My eyes were glued to the laptop screen, fingers hovering over the keys as I punched numbers into a spreadsheet. Rows of figures stared back at me. Rent, groceries, that extra shift I'd picked up last week. All of it was adding up to one thing, a down payment for a house of my own, a little place with a porch, maybe some quiet away from the city hum. That dream kept me going, even on nights like this when the cold seeped through the walls and the heater groaned like an old friend too tired to keep up. The phone buzzed on the table, cutting through my focus. I glanced at the screen. Mom, Delphine with her warm voice and knack for pulling me into things I'd rather dodge. I let it ring once, twice, then sighed and picked up. "Hey, sweetie," she said, her tone all sugar and coaxing, like she was about to sell me something. "I'm putting together a family dinner next week. Grayson's been so stressed lately, and I thought it'd be good for us all to sit down together." I could picture her in that kitchen of hers, apron on, stirring something on the stove while she worked her magic. She had a way of making you feel guilty for saying no, Grayson. My brother's name alone made my jaw tighten. I leaned back in my chair, the springs creaking under me, and rubbed my temple. Just last month, he'd strutted into Mom and Dad's place with a shiny new flat-screen TV, crowing about how he had to have it for football season. 2 days later, there he was, texting me, "Hey sis, spot me $20 for gas." I'd stared at that message, my thumb hovering over the reply button, before muttering to myself, "Not my problem." I didn't send the money. He didn't bring it up again. But I knew that wasn't the end of it. Grayson never let anything go when it came to what he thought he deserved. "Savannah? You there?" Mom's voice pulled me back. I could hear the hope in it, the little lilt that said she'd already decided I was coming. I glanced at the papers scattered on my table, listings for houses I'd circled in red ink, dreams I was scraping together penny by penny. "Yeah, Mom," I said finally, my voice softer than I meant it to be. "I'll come." It wasn't for Grayson, though, and it wasn't even really for her. It was for Dad. Thatcher, with his steady presence and quiet way of seeing through the nonsense. He didn't fall for Grayson's big talk, and I missed that calm he brought to the room. Maybe it'd be worth the hassle just to sit across from him for an hour. "Good," Mom chirped, satisfied. "It'll be nice to have us all together." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and set the phone down. The wind picked up again, a low moan that seemed to echo my own unease. I tried to get back to my numbers, but my mind was already drifting, picturing Grayson's loud laugh, the way he'd fill the room with himself and leave no space for anyone else. He'd been texting me lately, little hints about some car dreams he had. A new ride, probably something flashy he couldn't afford. I didn't need to guess who he thought should help foot the bill. My savings weren't his piggy bank, but try telling him that. I pushed the laptop aside and stood, stretching my arms over my head. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the walls closing in with that familiar itch of dread. I'd said yes to dinner, but I knew what I was walking into. Grayson's entitlement, Mom's gentle nudging, and me stuck in the middle, trying to hold my ground. I shuffled to the window, peering out at the street below. The Christmas lights were starting to go up, tiny dots of color blinking against the gray evening. They should have felt cheerful, but all I could think about was how Grayson's shadow always seemed to stretch longer than it should. The phone pinged again, a sharp sound that made me flinch. I turned back to the table, picking it up with a sinking feeling. Grayson's name lit up the screen, his message short and smug. "You coming, sis? Need a favor." I stared at it, my thumb brushing the edge of the case. Here we go, I thought, the words settling heavy in my chest. Outside, the wind kicked up another notch, and I could almost hear his laugh riding it, loud, brash, and ready to shake everything I'd been building. Life's funny that way. You can plan all you want, but family has a knack for stirring the pot just when you think it's simmering down. I pushed open the front door of Mom and Dad's house, and a wave of warmth hit me, laced with the smoky tang of BBQ ribs fresh from the oven. Outside, the early December chill had frosted the windows into blurry panes, but in here, the glow of fairy lights strung along the porch spilled a soft golden haze into the living room. I shook off the cold, my boots scuffing the worn welcome mat, and braced myself. Grayson's grin, wide, sharp, and smug as ever, was already waiting for me across the dining table, a dead giveaway that he had a plan brewing, and I was the punchline he'd been itching to deliver. Mom, Delphine with her knack for fussing, swooped in before I could even catch my breath. "Oh, Savannah, honey, let me take that scarf," she said, her hands tugging at the wool around my neck like I was still 10 years old. Her cheeks were flushed from the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour, and her voice carried that overly bright tone she used when she wanted everyone to play nice. I let her fuss, giving her a quick hug, the kind that said I was here but not fully committed. Over her shoulder, I caught Dad's eye. Thatcher, sitting in his old leather chair by the fireplace, steady as a rock. He gave me a small nod, his coffee mug cradled in his hands, and I felt a flicker of relief. At least one person in this room wasn't about to fall for whatever Grayson had up his sleeve. And there he was, sprawled at the table like he owned the place, legs kicked out and a local IPA in his grip. The bottle's label was some craft brew from downtown Asheville, probably one of those overpriced ones he liked to flaunt. He cracked it open with a loud pop, the foam bubbling up and clinging to the glass, and took a long sip, eyeing me over the rim. "Well, look who made it," he said, his voice loud enough to fill the room, cocky enough to make my skin itch. "Thought you'd be too busy counting your pennies to show up." I ignored him, sliding into a chair across the table and reaching for the mac and cheese. The spoon scraped the dish, and I piled a helping onto my plate, keeping my eyes down. He wasn't getting a rise out of me. Not yet. Mom bustled back in, setting a platter of ribs in the center of the table, the meat glistening under the chandelier's soft light. "Grayson was just telling us about this brewery he went to," she said, her cheerfulness a little too forced. "What was it called, hun?" Grayson leaned back, spinning the beer bottle lazily between his fingers. "Oh, you know, that new place on Patton Avenue," he said like it was no big deal. "Had to splurge a little. Life's too short for cheap beer, right?" He grinned again, that wide, toothy look that screamed he was full of it. I stabbed a fork into my mac and cheese, the creamy smell doing nothing to ease the twist in my gut. Splurge my foot. I'd bet my last dollar that bottle was the only thing he'd paid for in weeks. Dad stayed quiet, sipping his coffee, his eyes flicking between us. He had that way of watching, like he saw everything but didn't need to say it out loud. I envied that about him, the calm he carried while the rest of us danced around Grayson's noise. Mom kept chattering, filling the air with small talk about the neighbors and the Christmas lights going up around Asheville. I nodded along, letting her words wash over me, but my focus was on Grayson. He took another swig of his beer, then set it down with a deliberate clink, his gaze locking onto mine. "Savannah's killing it at work, huh?" he said, his tone shifting, smooth and slippery now. "All those extra shifts must be raking it in." I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, and lowered it slowly. There it was, the pivot. He'd been greasing me up with that favor text all week, dropping hints like breadcrumbs, and now he was circling in for the kill. I forced a shrug, keeping my voice even. "I get by," I said, scooping another bite of mac and cheese and chewing like it was the most interesting thing in the world. But he didn't let it go. That grin stretched wider, like he'd already got me cornered, and he leaned forward just enough to make it personal. "Come on, sis," he said, his voice dripping with fake charm. You're doing better than getting by, I can tell." The room felt smaller all of a sudden, the fairy lights outside blurring into a hazy glow through the frosted glass. Mom hummed as she wiped her hands on her apron, oblivious to the shift, while Dad's coffee mug paused halfway to his lips. I set my fork down, the metal clinking against the plate, and met Grayson's eyes. He was still grinning, still sipping that beer he couldn't afford, still acting like the world owed him something, starting with me. I could feel the tension simmering, a low heat that hadn't hit the boiling point yet, but it was close, too close. I pushed my chair back a little, just enough to breathe, and wipe my hands on my napkin. Whatever he was fishing for, I wasn't biting, not out here in front of everyone. "Savannah, you want more ribs?" Mom asked, breaking the silence. Her voice a lifeline I didn't take. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "I'm good, Mom." Grayson chuckled, a low rumble that grated on my nerves, and tapped his beer bottle against the table. He leaned in then, his voice dropping over the clink of forks, smooth and quiet so only I could hear. "Need a quick chat after this. Big favor, sis." The words hung there, heavy and loaded, and I felt my stomach twist again. I didn't answer, just picked up my fork and stabbed at my plate, the foam still clinging to his glass like a badge of his broke but showy charade. Some folks think family's a bond that holds you up. Others treat it like a net to catch what they can't earn themselves. Guess which one Grayson was. The wind was howling outside now, a wild, restless sound that pressed against the dining room windows like it wanted in. I sat at the table staring at the smear of BBQ sauce on my plate, the ribs long gone cold. A single candle flickered in the center, casting shaky shadows over the checkered tablecloth Mom had laid out. Grayson's voice from across the room had been buzzing in my ears all night, but now it was different, sharper, like a blade he'd been honing just for me. He thought family was some kind of golden ticket to my wallet, a free pass he could flash whenever he pleased. I wasn't here for that, and the way my fingers tightened around my fork said it louder than words. He'd been sipping that craft IPA earlier, the one he'd splurged on like some big shot, bragging about its fancy hops while the foam stuck to his glass. Fancy tastes don't pay the bills, though, and I'd seen right through it. Another show, another grab. Now he was at it again, leaning back in his chair, tapping his plate with his fork in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Savannah," he started, his voice smooth as honey. "You're saving up, right? Jobs treating you good these days?" The candlelight caught the glint in his eyes, that smug little spark he always carried when he thought he had the upper hand. I shrugged, keeping my gaze on my plate, scraping at a bit of leftover mac and cheese. "Just getting by," I said, my tone flat, hoping he'd drop it. But Grayson never dropped anything, not when he smelled a payout. He leaned closer, the chair creaking under him, and that smirk stretched wider like he'd already won some game I didn't sign up to play. "Come on, sis," he said, his voice dipping low, all charm and no shame. "I need a car, something decent to get around in. Family helps family, you know?" His fork tapped once more, a punctuation mark to his pitch, and those eyes glinted again, daring me to say no. The air in the room shifted, heavier now, like the wind outside had sucked out the warmth. Mom, Delphine, looked up from her spot by the kitchen doorway, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. "It'd be sweet if you could help him out, Savannah," she said, her voice soft and nervous, the peacemaker tone she always used when Grayson started pushing buttons. She gave me a little smile, the kind that begged me to keep things smooth, to not rock the boat. I glanced at Dad, Thatcher, hoping for backup, but he just sat there, his coffee mug still in his hands, steam curling up as he watched us. His silence was steady, but it didn't tell me what he was thinking, and that left me on my own. I set my fork down, the metal clinking hard against the plate, and took a slow breath. My chest felt tight, like the walls were closing in, but I wasn't about to let Grayson waltz off with my savings. Not for a car, not for anything. "I'm not your bank, Grayson," I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through his smug little act. His smirk faltered just for a split second, a crack in that cocky armor he wore so well. I saw it. The flicker of surprise in his eyes, the way his hand paused mid-tap. He hadn't expected me to push back, not like that, not right here with Mom and Dad watching. For a moment, the room went still, the candle's flame dancing like it was holding its breath too. Mom's smile faded, her fingers knotting tighter in her apron, and Dad's mug finally lowered an inch, his eyes narrowing just a touch. Grayson recovered fast, though. Too fast. He straightened up, the smirk sliding back into place, and let out a low chuckle that grated on my nerves. "Oh, I see how it is," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, his tone shifting to something harder, something meaner. "What, too good for me now? Too busy hoarding your cash to help your own brother? Let's see what Mom and Dad think about that." His words hung there, sharp and accusing, like he'd just thrown down a gauntlet he expected me to trip over. My hand brushed my pocket, the outline of my phone solid against my fingers, and I felt a jolt of something. Anger, maybe, or just the weight of those texts still sitting there, waiting. I didn't pull it out, not yet, but knowing they were there steadied me. Mom's eyes darted between us, her mouth opening like she wanted to say something, but nothing came. Dad's mug hit the table with a soft thud, his silence louder now, and I could feel the storm brewing, the kind that had been building for years under Grayson's noise and Mom's smoothing over. I pushed my plate away, the BBQ stains blurring into the tablecloth, and leaned back in my chair. The wind outside roared louder, rattling the windows like it was cheering Grayson on, but I wasn't backing down. Not tonight. He wanted a fight, wanted to paint me as the stingy one, the bad sister. Fine. Let him try. I'd worked too hard, scraped too long to let him guilt me into handing over what I'd earned. Family's a tie that binds, sure, but it's not a blank check for someone else's wants, and Grayson was about to learn that the hard way. The icy wind battered the windows, a relentless drum roll that matched the pounding in my chest. I sat at the dining table, the candlelight flickering like it was on its last gasp, throwing jagged shadows across the cold BBQ plates and crumpled napkins. Grayson's voice had been needling me all night, but now it was a full-on assault, his smug grin daring me to crack. He was ready to shame me in front of everyone, to paint me as the selfish sister who wouldn't lift a finger for her own blood. But I wasn't empty-handed. I had a card he didn't see coming, and my fingers were already itching to play it. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, and let his voice rise, loud and brassy, filling the room like he owned it. "Savannah's too good to help her own brother. Some family, huh?" he said, tossing the words out like a challenge, his eyes glinting with that overconfidence I'd seen 100 times before. He stretched his arms wide, like he was putting on a show, and I could feel the heat creeping up my neck. This wasn't just about the car anymore. This was him trying to drag me down, to make me the bad guy in front of Mom and Dad, like he'd done so many times when we were kids. Mom, Delphine, shifted in her seat, her napkin twisted into a tight knot between her fingers. "Let's not fight, y'all," she murmured, her voice thin and shaky, the same old plea she'd been using since Grayson and I were scrapping over toys. She darted a glance my way, her eyes wide with that nervous hope that I'd just nod and let it slide. Keep the peace, like always. I didn't look back at her. Instead, I caught Dad, Thatcher, out of the corner of my eye. He'd shifted forward in his chair, his coffee mug set aside, those sharp eyes of his locked on Grayson now. He didn't say a word, but the way he leaned in, steady and unblinking, told me he was waiting to see how this played out. I took a breath, slow and deep, my hand sliding into my pocket where my phone sat, solid and heavy against my palm. My heart thumped hard, a steady beat that drowned out the wind for a moment. Grayson's texts from November, those nasty little jabs he'd sent to his buddy, had been burning a hole in my mind ever since I'd seen them. "Savannah's selfish, won't help family," he'd written, like I was some stingy outsider instead of the sister he'd been leaning on for years. He'd buried himself with those words, and I was holding the shovel to dig it all up. My thumb brushed the screen, waking it to life, and I scrolled to the message, the glow casting a faint blue light across my lap. Grayson kept talking, his voice booming over the clatter of the storm outside. "What kind of sister sits on her cash while I'm out here struggling?" he said, shaking his head like I'd personally offended him. The smugness in his tone, the way he played it up for Mom and Dad, it was too much. I tightened my grip on the phone, my knuckles whitening, and stood up just enough to lean across the table. "This what you mean by family, Grayson?" I said, my voice slicing through his bluster like a knife through butter. I held the screen up, tilting it so the words glared in the dim light, bright and accusing. The room froze. His smirk vanished, wiped clean like someone had flipped a switch. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The candle sputtered, its flame dipping low, and the wind outside seemed to hold its breath too. Mom's napkin fell to the table, her hands trembling as she stared at the phone, her mouth half open. Dad's chair scraped an inch forward, his eyes narrowing as he read the screen, sharp and focused now. Grayson's face went slack, the color draining from it, and I watched the realization hit him. Those texts weren't just hot air anymore. They were a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. His hands shot up, flailing like he could wave it all away, and his voice came out in a stammer, high and desperate. "That's not... You're twisting it," he blurted, the words tripping over each other as he scrambled to save face. I didn't lower the phone, didn't flinch. My heart was still racing, but there was a steadiness in me now, a quiet fire that kept me rooted. Grayson's bravado was flickering out, just like that candle, and I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, the way his hands dropped to the table. Useless. Mom's breath hitched, a little gasp that broke the silence, and Dad's gaze shifted to me, something like a nod in his eyes. I'd played my card, and the table had turned. Grayson wasn't the golden boy tonight, not with his own words staring him down. The wind picked up again, rattling the windows harder, but it didn't matter. The air in here was thick with something else now. Truth, maybe, or just the weight of what Grayson had tried to pull. I set the phone down, screen still glowing, and leaned back in my chair, my hands steady at last. People can talk all they want about family loyalty, but when it's built on sand, one good gust can bring it all down. Grayson was learning that now, and I wasn't about to let him forget it. The dining room felt like a held breath, the kind you take right before a storm breaks loose. The wind whistled outside, a sharp, mournful sound that curled through the cracks in the windows, but inside it was the silence that weighed heaviest. Grayson's smug armor was cracking right in front of us, his usual bravado crumbling into something small and shaky, and for once, I wasn't the one scrambling to pick up the pieces. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, watching it unfold like a scene I'd waited years to see. The candle on the table had burned low, its flame a weak sputter against the cold plates of BBQ ribs, shoved aside, the air thick with the aftermath of truth. Grayson forced a laugh, the sound thin and brittle, like a twig snapping underfoot. "It's just a joke. Chill out," he said, his voice pitching higher than usual, a desperate grab to brush it all off. But nobody was buying it. Not this time. His eyes darted around the table, wild and searching, landing on Mom, then Dad, then me, like he was begging for someone to toss him a lifeline. The phone still sat between us, its screen dark now, but the words it had shown still hanging in the air. "Savannah's selfish, won't help family." He'd thrown that out to his buddy last month, thinking it had never come back to bite him, and now it was all he had left to stand on. A shaky foundation if I ever saw one. Dad, Thatcher, moved first, setting his coffee mug down with a deliberate thud that cut through Grayson's flimsy excuse. The steam had long stopped rising, but his hand stayed steady around the ceramic, his face carved from stone. "You've been playing us too long, Grayson," he said, his voice low and firm, the kind of tone that didn't leave room for argument. "Enough!" The word landed like a gavel, final and unyielding, and I felt a shiver run down my spine, not from the cold, but from the weight of it. Dad didn't talk much, but when he did, it stuck, and I could see Grayson shrinking under it, his shoulders hunching like a kid caught sneaking cookies. Mom, Delphine, gasped, a soft, sharp sound that broke the stillness. Her hands trembled as she reached for her napkin, clutching it like it could hold her together. She'd always been the one to patch up Grayson's messes, smoothing over his tantrums with a smile and a hug. But now she just stared at me, her eyes wide and watery. "Savannah," she whispered, her voice cracking on my name. "I didn't know. I'm so sorry." The words tumbled out, raw and unsteady, and I saw the shock settle into her face, the lines deepening around her mouth. She looked smaller somehow, like the truth had taken something from her too, and for a moment, I almost felt bad. Almost. I didn't say anything, just kept my arms crossed, my gaze steady on Grayson. He was unraveling fast, the cocky grin gone, replaced by a panicked twitch at the corner of his mouth. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, and he tried to laugh again, but it came out more like a choke. "You're all blowing this way out of proportion," he said, his voice cracking now, the bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. But Dad's words had landed too deep, and Mom's apology had sealed it. There was no wiggling out of this one. His eyes flicked to me again, and I saw it. The realization that his little game was over, that I wasn't the pushover he'd counted on. The wind howled louder outside, a gust that shook the panes and made the candle flicker one last time before steadying. Grayson's mask was shattered, pieces of it scattered across the table in the silence that followed. I didn't move, didn't blink, just watched as he tried to pull himself together, his hands shaking as he pushed back from the table. The chair scraped hard against the floor, a jagged sound that matched the glare he shot my way. "Happy now?" he snapped, his voice loud and raw, the last gasp of a man who'd lost the room. He didn't wait for an answer, just turned and stormed out, his boots pounding the hardwood until the front door slammed shut behind him, the echo ringing in my ears. The quiet that settled in after was heavy, almost suffocating. Mom's hands dropped to her lap, the napkin falling limp, and she stared at the spot where Grayson had been, her breath hitching softly. Dad leaned back in his chair, his face stern but calm, like he'd said what needed saying, and that was that. I uncrossed my arms, letting them rest on the table, my fingers brushing the edge of my plate. The BBQ was cold now, the sauce congealing into a sticky mess, and the vibe in the room matched it, chilled, emptied out. I didn't feel triumph. Not exactly. But there was a lightness creeping in, a release I hadn't expected. The wind kept up its racket outside, a reminder that the world was still turning, even if this little corner of it had just shifted. Mom reached out, her hand hovering over mine, but she pulled back before touching me, like she wasn't sure where we stood now. Dad picked up his mug again, taking a slow sip, his eyes meeting mine over the rim. There was no going back from this. Not for Grayson, not for any of us. Sometimes you've got to let the cracks show, I thought, watching the candle's weak glow. It's the only way to see what's really holding things together, or what's been falling apart all along. The snow was piling up outside my Asheville apartment, a soft, steady drift that muffled the world beyond my window. I struck a match, the tiny hiss breaking the quiet, and touched it to the wick of a candle on my table. A warm glow spread, pushing back the January chill that lingered in the corners of the room. 3 weeks had passed since that dinner, since Grayson storming out had left the dining room echoing with his absence. He was out of the picture now, at least for me, and with him went the guilt trip he'd been dragging me along on for years. I settled into my chair, the creak of it familiar and comforting, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The flame danced, steady and small, and I watched the snow stack higher against the glass, each flake a quiet promise of a fresh start. Mom, Delphine, had called yesterday, her voice still shaky over the line. "We're going to sit down with Grayson soon," she'd said, the words tumbling out fast, like she needed to convince herself as much as me. "He needs to hear it from us, needs to understand." I'd listened, nodding even though she couldn't see me, picturing her in that kitchen of hers, probably twisting her apron into knots again. She sounded rattled, like the ground under her feet wasn't as solid as it used to be, and I couldn't blame her. Grayson had always been her project, the one she patched up and sent back out into the world. I wondered if she'd try it again this time, or if something had finally shifted for good. My phone buzzed on the table, a soft vibration that made the candlelight flicker for a second. I picked it up, the screen lighting up with a text from Dad. "Thatcher. "Proud of you, kid," it read, simple and straight, the way he always was. "Family's about trust, not tricks or handouts." I stared at it, the words sinking in deeper than I expected, a quiet weight that settled somewhere warm inside me. Dad didn't waste words, never had, and this wasn't just a pat on the back. It was him saying he'd seen it all, the way Grayson had played us, the way I'd stood my ground. I set the phone down, my fingers lingering on the edge, and felt a smile tug at my lips. That was Dad, steady as the mountains outside and twice as solid. Another buzz came a moment later, but this one I didn't rush to check. I knew who it was before I even looked. Grayson, right on cue. He'd messaged me last week, a long ramble about misunderstandings and how I'd blown it all out of proportion. I'd seen it pop up on my lock screen, his name glaring at me, and let it sit there unread, a little gray bubble I had no intention of popping open. He'd probably text again soon, some half-baked excuse or sob story, thinking he could reel me back in. I wasn't biting. Not anymore. My house fund, those dollars I'd scraped together shift by shift, was mine to keep, and I wasn't about to let him guilt me out of it. The snow kept falling, a white curtain that felt like a wall between me and his noise, and I was grateful for it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and watched the candle's flame stretch and sway. The apartment was quiet now, just the soft crackle of the wick and the distant hum of the heater kicking on. Mom's call still echoed in my head, her voice threading through my thoughts. Shaken, yes, but there was a hint of something new in it, a resolve I hadn't heard before. And Dad's text, short as it was, carried a strength that stayed with me, a reminder of what family could be when the masks came off. I thought about that night, the way Grayson's chair had scraped the floor, the slam of the doors he'd bolted. He'd wanted me to feel small, to cave under his glare, but I hadn't. For the first time, I'd held my own, and the weight of that was still settling in. The candle's warmth spread, a gentle heat that brushed against my hands, and I let my gaze drift to the window again. The snow was thicker now, blanketing the street in a hush that felt almost sacred. I'd spent so long bracing for Grayson's next move, dodging his jabs, that this stillness caught me off guard. Peace might just stick around this time, I thought, the idea soft and tentative, like the flame in front of me. My house fund was safe, my plans were mine again, and the family I'd always known was shifting into something new, maybe something truer. I'd fought for that, in my own quiet way, and it felt good to sit here now, free of the tug of war. I stared at the flame a little longer, its glow steady against the dark, and a question slipped into my mind, unbidden but clear. "What would you do with a brother like that?" I murmured, the words barely a whisper, hanging in the air like a thread I didn't need to pull. I didn't have an answer, not yet, but it didn't matter. The snow kept falling, the candle kept burning, and for now, that was enough. Life's a funny thing. It can twist you up in knots, but sometimes letting go of the tangle is the kindest thing you can do, for them and for yourself. As I watched the candle's glow flicker against the snow piling up outside my Asheville window, I felt a quiet settle over me, a peace I hadn't known in years with Grayson's shadow gone. That night at dinner showed me family isn't about who takes the most, but who's willing to stand by you when the masks fall off. In life, it's the trust we build that holds us together, not the guilt we carry. I'm still learning to let go of the tangles, and maybe Mom and Dad are too, finding a new way to love through the cracks. If this little tale of ours stirs something in you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you keep family close when the road gets rough?